Hey everyone, I'm the Real Eveb. This is part 2 of the How to Play Guardian miniseries. In our first part, we discussed gems and how to use them most effectively, at least the way I know how. And in this part, we are discussing defensive mode. Just as a general thing, Guardian has been acknowledged to suffer a bit of complexity issues in regards to basically all of its main mechanics. Gems are the easiest to understand, but the hardest to execute. Defensive mode has a bunch of rules and mechanics about how it works, and stasis is filled with keywords that you have to learn. But regardless, I think that once you get the hang of it, it is possible to understand. So let's start out with what exactly defensive mode is. And I'm realizing that I already forgot something. So let me just put that in. Yep. That's usually the thing I overlook because defensive mode is mainly a defensive mechanism. But the thorns are very useful. Maybe I should come back to that later. Anyways, defensive mode, the gist of it is that whenever you enter defensive mode, it gives you 10 block immediately. And then on the next turn, it gives you 10 more block. So 10 block for 2 turns. Back-to-back turns. Block carries over between those 2 turns. So whenever you first enter defensive, you get that 10 block. And then whatever block you don't use, say you play some more block cards, and then you're able to block the attack or are not attacked at all, you carry whatever block you have left over to the next turn. It's basically a stack of blur, from the silent card, without actually giving you the blur, what is it called? The blur power on your power bar. You just have to remember that's a part of defensive mode, which is an interesting decision. And yes, it gives you 3 thorns on that first 10 block turn. The second turn is technically you exiting defensive. You get a 10 block bonus for exiting defensive as well as entering. So the 3 thorns is whenever you're in that defensive mode for 1 turn. You can enter defensive mode with a couple of things that enter it directly, such as Spheric Shield, the rare card, and Polishing Oil, the uncommon potion that enters defensive and gives you 10 block as well. But the main way to enter, and the way that you need to keep track of, is by reducing your brace counter to 0. And you can do that by playing cards that say brace and then a number, such as brace 8, or by losing HP. If you lose 5 HP, you lose 5 brace, or reduce the counter by 5. And the brace requirement increases by 10 every time it's reduced to 0. It starts at 20, which is perfect for your starting relic plus your starting deck. Gear Up is the card given by Bronze Gear, which braces 10, and Curl Up is in your starting deck, which also braces for 10. So by the time you draw Curl Up, you will have enough brace to enter defensive with just your starting deck on your first shuffle. And then every time you enter defensive, by that method, by reducing the counter to 0, the requirement increases by 10. So after reducing your brace to 0 for the first time, you will need another 30 brace in order to enter defensive mode next. And notice that it's only whenever the counter is reduced to 0. Those 2 things, Spheric Shield and Polishing Oil, that enter defensive mode directly, do not make your brace count requirement go up. It is only whenever you reduce the brace counter to 0. And that's good, because that means it's essentially free defensive mode. It doesn't come with the inherent cost of it being harder to enter every time you use it. It does have a maximum of 50 at least, which is not easy, but it exists. Also, something I didn't mention here is that if you use too much brace to enter defensive, then it carries over to the next counter. So if if I have 2 brace left, or 2 points on the counter left, and I brace for 8, I will brace for that 2, enter defensive, and then I will brace, and then the rest of the 6 brace is used. So I'll enter defensive for the first time, the counter is reset to 30, and then I brace for, and then I reduce it by 6 more, so down to 24 from 2. So yeah, that's a lot of different things to keep track of, but those are the exact mechanics. The way that defensive mode usually plays out is that you just use it for the 10 block apiece for 2 turns. The brace counter is on your power bar, so you never have to keep track in your head about where you're at the moment. But you will learn to control when you enter defensive mode for the most part, so that you can effectively use that 2 turns of block. So in order to best use the 2 turns of 10 block, knowing enemy attack patterns is really important, for multiple reasons, which is why it's really important. The first is so that you can plan when you enter defensive for that first 10 block. Like if you know that an enemy is going to be attacking next turn, and if you know the enemy attack patterns, there's plenty of enemies which you can figure that out for. If you know they're going to do it next turn, you can set up your brace counter to be close enough to enter for next turn, or you can enter that turn because the block carries over between turns, and then have a lot of block for next turn. Depending on what the enemy does after that turn, you may want to change it up. Like for example, Jawworm. If you enter defensive on turn 1, you'll be able to block their 12 damage hit, which is good. But the next turn they have a very high chance of not attacking. So that extra 10 block on the second turn, plus whatever carried over from the first turn, is lost. And at the same time, it's a lot harder to enter defensive mode again. In fact, you probably won't be able to because it's Act 1 in a Jawworm fight. So if you're able to block turn 1 mostly with just block cards, then maybe you can enter defensive on turn 2 for the turn 3 attack, or enter it on turn 3 for the turn 3 and 4 attack. That's just one fight. Gremlin Knob and Lagavulin are very important to juggle defensive mode for as well. Lagavulin's generally not that difficult. I think at max, usually you take 5 or 10 damage. Often you can take 0. So long as you enter defensive on Lagavulin's first attack turn. So that's usually turn 4, but it's always the turn after you wake them up. And Gremlin Knob, you kind of have to juggle the brace numbers plus the damage you take from their first 8 damage attack if you're on Ascension 18 or higher. Otherwise, it's going to be randomized. But yeah. So knowing those enemy attack patterns is important so that you can weigh your options of entering defensive mode the turn before you get attacked or the turn of getting attacked. Because you either need that 10 block immediately, or you need the turn, or you either need the stacked block for 1 turn, or you need the 10 block spread out over 2 turns. So learning enemy intents is definitely a skill that you learn over time, rather than something that you can do very easily if you're just starting out in the game, or if you're not that good at the game yet. But over time it will get easier. And I think even if you're watching this and you're not very good at the game in general, playing Guardian may actually make you better at learning those enemy attack patterns, because defensive mode is so integral to the playstyle. You'll learn that entering defensive mode on certain turns pays off a lot more than entering it other times. You'll especially learn the times where it doesn't work. I know this from personal experience. But yeah, enemy attack patterns, pretty much the most important thing when you're figuring out when to enter defensive mode. By the way, I'm just realizing now, I also forgot to say something about this. If you enter defensive mode multiple times, either by reducing the brace counter or by using the direct entries or both, if you enter it while you're in defensive mode already, you'll gain an extra turn. And for each turn you enter defensive mode, you'll gain another 10 block. Except if it's those direct entries. Those direct entries have block attached to them already that they tell you you're going to get. So yeah, you'll get another turn, you'll get another 10 block. Overall, you keep the same number, you keep the same amount of block that you would get normally from defensive mode. Anyways, back to this. Brace cards. I have the full list of brace cards here. Or just defensive mode cards in general, since this one doesn't brace. This is what I mean by a direct entry. By the way, I should do this. Potion, 0, Guardian, Defensive. There we go. And there's our potion, Polishing Oil. Gain 10 block, enter defensive mode. So yeah, those two. And yeah, these cards just say brace and then a number, and that will reduce your counter by that much, carries over between defensive modes, and so on. So yeah, that's what that looks like. So taking brace cards generally does nothing unless you enter defensive mode. And this is a stumbling point for a lot of people whenever it comes to learning Guardian in the first place. Because a card such as Roll Attack, for example, it's 2 energy, 16 damage, which is not very good compared to most characters. The Brace 8 doesn't seem very good either because with the low damage attached, you don't know if you're entering defensive mode with this 8 Brace. And people kind of innately intuit this. I think people latch onto this in defensive mode thing a lot more, which barely ever happens, by the way. So yeah, people kind of already, most people I think kind of already understand that Brace is kind of bad by itself, because you don't know whether you're entering defensive mode. But that being said, it's still very much needed, because it's an investment. Excuse me. I don't know if you heard that, I just hit the microphone. It's an investment because the more Brace you build up, the more reliable your defensive mode and your block will overall become. More reliability means that you can get more front load, which is using the 10 block that you gain on the turn that you are getting attacked, as well as more control, which is using it to build up block for the second turn with the blur. So yeah, building a Brace with your cards is important because it means that you can enter defensive mode when you need it, and how often you need it. Because 20 block is a lot, even though it's split over 2 turns. And the blur is also a lot. So, I had to learn that Roll Attack was actually a really good card. The 16 damage is very, it's very deceptively low. It's actually very solid in terms of damage, and the Brace 8 is actually some of the highest Brace that you can get in the game. I'll get to this a bit later, but this does end up being a good card because that investment is so high, and because of Guardian's defensive nature, meaning that the lower damage numbers isn't as bad. So yeah, unfortunately a lot of Brace cards don't brace for very much. 3 or 4 is usually the area. There are a few good Brace cards, like the Brace 8s, the starting relic giving you a Brace 10, and Curl Up being Brace 10 or 12. So yeah, there's a few. There's a bit of a gap in how good the Brace cards are just for the Brace, but they are generally still important to take over time. so long as you can make use of the other effects of the card. Role of defensive mode in your runs. It's important to remember that 2 turns of 10 block is not going to be enough the whole game. It is crucial and integral to your early to mid game. 20 block is a lot for Act 1 and 2, specifically. Act 1, it's just a ton of block. Before the starter relic change, it was even more block. It was 30 block the first time you entered, 20 on the first turn, plus 10 on the next. But 20 is often more than enough for Act 1. And for Act 2, it will block a very significant portion of incoming damage. And those fights hit hard. You do need some kind of good defensive cards for Act 2 in order to not take a ton of damage. So defensive mode is really good for those first things. Act 1 just for the sheer numbers, and Act 2 because you need that front-loaded block. In the late game, though, it's not useless. It's far from useless. Defensive mode is so very good. It is a supplementary block. It is most often not a block system in and of itself. If you were to build pure brace, pure defensive mode, remember this brace requirement increases by 10 every time you reduce it to 0. So the first time you enter it's 20, not so bad, 30, not so bad, 40 and 50 for the rest of the fight gets really hard. And remember, this is only giving you 10 block every turn of defensive. So yeah, during the late game you're going to need more than that. And you're going to need it for longer than that. So unless you build a ton of brace cards, like with the protocols perhaps, or with the brace 8 cards, which we'll all get to a bit later, and also simultaneously have a really strong scaling damage system, it's not going to be good enough. Especially because Guardian is a stalling character. Defensive mode is very much bursty and runs out fast, so you can't stall effectively with it. So again, if you don't find that huge damage where you can kill things fast due to your really good scaling, it's not going to work out. So what you do in the late game most of the time is you use it as a supplementary block, both for, well, I guess mostly for the control, but also just for the 10 block a turn. It's not very much, like I said, but it can help a bit, you know. It's 2 defense together for the price of whatever it took to get into it, and that's over 2 turns. The blur especially becomes very powerful in the late game. So for the rest of your defense, you're looking for. I went through all of these the cards, and I think the ways that you can gain more defense is through dexterity, stasis, and relics. Relics are kind of a given; they happen for every character. Stasis, by putting block cards into stasis and then getting them out for free on future turns, that can be a good way. And scaling with dexterity, you can maybe get away with temporary dexterity, but also permanent dexterity with debuff reduction on temporary dexterity. Keeping that and then using block cards to scale your defense, or the rest of your defense. And you know, between all those things, you don't need a ton of any one of them, so it shouldn't be too difficult to find a winning combination. Alright. So yeah, just make sure you're not relying solely on defensive mode. I find myself falling into that trap a few times, and even during this series. So yeah. I guess if I want to talk about this 3 Thorns real quick, I don't really think about it too much because it's often not that important. It's kind of important against the heart, I've noticed. If I enter defensive mode for the multi-attack turn, it does a lot of damage. Especially if I have one of the other Thorns cards in the deck. That can be like 7 Thorns against the heart's multi-attack. That's 105 damage, which is insane. Excuse me a sec. But yeah, since it only lasts for 1 turn in defensive and it's the first turn, it's not very useful most of the time. Enemies have to be multi-attacking as well on the correct turn, You could be using defensive mode for the blur for next turn more than you're using it for the turn you're using it, more than the turn you entered it on. Like if you know a big attack's coming next turn and they're not attacking this turn, those 3 thorns go to waste. So yeah, it's not a big deal. It's just there because it was part of the original Guardian fight, although the original Guardian fight has piercing hide? Sharp hide is what it's called, which damages you when you play an attack card rather than every hit. But you know, this can help in the early game sometimes. Act 1 especially, I've noticed it doing some work. It can get you across a threshold for Gremlin Knob, or it can get you across a threshold for easy hallway fights. 3 damage is not to be completely discounted. It's just not very much. Alright, so now that we've talked about the general stuff, let's move on to the specifics. The cards and the relics, mostly. So let's start with Gear Up here. Gear Up is part of Bronze Gear, your starter relic. Retain Brace 10 Exhaust, and it costs 1. You get this at the start of your turn 1, which means that it is always available to you. Same as, well, almost the same as Curl Up, since Curl Up is in your starting deck. It is available to you from the beginning of the game. You just might not have it on turn 1. And between these 2 cards, you gain Brace 20, which is exactly how much you need to enter defensive mode the first time in a fight. And that's really important. That's not something that Guardian had before. It was a lot more difficult to enter defensive on the first shuffle of your deck before this change. Someone did point out on the Downfall Discord that since you're spending 2 energy for 10 block, it's essentially like playing 2 defends. And I get where they're coming from. I think that they do have a point about that. It does feel a bit inefficient. But I think that the rest of the effects of defensive mode, namely the 10 block on the turn after, as well as the blur between the 2 turns, makes it more than worth it. And I don't think, like, that keeps it relevant for the rest of the game too. But even just the 10 block for 2 energy is not a bad thing either. Your starting deck, or I can't even show the starting deck, but you start with 4 strikes, 4 defense, Curl Up, and Twin Slam. And if you're on Ascension 10 or higher, you also have that 11th Ascender's Bane. So really you have a deck that is that has 4 cards out of 11 being block cards. And in hallway fights, easy full hallway fights, depending on your RNG, you can get some you can take some pretty nasty hits or perfect to fight. Completely up to RNG and your draws for those early fights. Maybe you get, like, obviously after the first 1 or 2 fights, you're going to pick up a good card, and then things get easier. But you're still leaving things up to chance most of the time. With this, as soon as you draw Curl Up, you've basically given yourself a hand with 2 more defense. So that increases your block density from 4 cards out of 11 to 5 cards out of 11. And that's huge when you're drawing 5 cards a turn. Before, there was a pretty good chance that you drew only 1 defend on a turn, and that could make you take 7 to 10 damage on a turn, depending on the fight. 7 is pretty common for Jawworm. There's even a non-negligible chance that you get 0 defense against Jawworm's first turn. That's happened with some frequency. 4 cards out of 11 means there's 7 cards that you can draw, and you only need to draw 5 of those 7. Let's see, what would those odds be? 7, 6. Let me break out the calculator for this. In fact, 7 times 6 times 5 times 4 is 3 divided by all this. 8 divided by 7, and we'll multiply 100 for percents. 4%, so 5% chance. 5% chance is not high, but 1 out of 20 runs it will happen. Not even 1 out of 20 runs. 1 out of 20 fights. And those chances get lower most of the time because you're taking attack cards. So that block density gets even lower, and this chance of completely whiffing on any defense gets higher. So yeah, it's I think that having this 5th card makes it a lot easier to have block consistently and make your early game more consistent. Or sorry, not this card, it's this card. Since that 5% increasing to maybe 6 or 7, 8 or 9 over the next 2 fights, and then compounding on top of itself, on top of each other, excuse me, since you're doing 3 fights in one run, that can be like a 20% chance total. Maybe somewhere like 16%. Maybe it's like a 1 in 6 chance. 1 in 6 runs you get a turn where you have 0 block. Even with 4 defense. But the addition of this 5th card means that you're probably going to get at least 1 worst case scenario, and you're very often going to get 2, which will full block or very close to full block most of the time. So the amount of HP that this saves in the early game, I think, is extremely significant, and is very important. And this gives you more control over when you enter defensive than if we didn't have the gear up. And again, that timing of defensive is important because of how you use defensive mode. You need to know enemy intents, you need to know when they're attacking and how big those attacks are. So control over defensive mode is key, and this gives you exactly that. One thing that this does mean, though, is that your first brace cards that you take out of this pool is less impactful. Before, you would take a couple brace cards in order to be able to enter defensive mode on your first shuffle. But now that we have this, we can already do that. So, what you're aiming for instead is maybe, I would say, around 3 brace cards that, when combined, give you 10 brace, so that in case you draw them before your curl up in that, you can enter defensive mode for the first time. And then over time you build up, that build up will increase so that you can enter defensive mode for the second time after 30 brace. So a bit less impactful, but I think still important to make that investment in order to have that defensive mode when you need it later in the game. Mainly Act 2, but also very late whenever you need to use the blur. So yeah, those are that. These are almost exactly the same, except this also has stasis attached. I'm not usually a fan of upgrading this, but the more I've done it, the more it feels good to do so. Having the control over which card goes into stasis is good. I do notice a lot whenever the card is underwhelming that I put in. Even though the upgrade doesn't seem like very good. Like, if you don't have the very obvious synergies like Orb Walk, which likes to be put into stasis, then choosing a card, like, you can already kind of manipulate your hand to just a few options for this to hit, and then you can play the odds. But it's I don't really understand why this feels better, but it just does. Maybe because the odds are high enough to miss that it happens frequently. Maybe that's a good enough reason to think so. Brace 12 is not that big either. 2 brace mattered a lot more before Gear Up came back. Because then you could just take a brace 8 card like Roll Attack, and then then you would only need those 2 cards to enter defensive. But now, not so much. Maybe more of a balancing tool. Maybe this could get buffed. Maybe it doesn't need it, who knows. But yeah, I'm not in need of an upgrade in Act 1, I don't think. Maybe by the end of Act 1, before the boss, would be the earliest I'd upgrade it. Unless I got, like, Snecko Eye. I've done that before with Snecko Eye, upgraded that over Twin Slam. Anyways, moving on. There are 3 common block cards that brace for small amounts. 3, 3, and 4. It's also worth noting that this upgrades to stay at 3. This upgrades to 4 and this starts at 4 and upgrades to 6. So 3 different things. Overall, very small. Priming shot is good when upgraded. The brace number anyway. The way that brace numbers usually work out, you're looking for that magic number in order to enter defensive mode. And here, now that we have gear up, that magic number is 10. And unfortunately for the number 3, you can't just take 3 of those cards. If you take 3 brace 3 cards, that adds up to 9. That's not good enough. You need at least 1 brace 4 or higher. Thankfully, since Priming Shot got a buff and Sapphire got moved to Common and got a buff, you have better chances of that. And Roll Attack also braces for 8, so Charger braces for 4. The only thing you need is 1 4 and 2 3s, and that can do it. That being said, like I mentioned before, you would have to draw them all before Curl Up in order for it to matter. Otherwise, you could just play Gear Up, Curl Up, and enter defensive that way. But you know, taking a few of these is still good because there are 3 brace 8 options, and any of these plus a brace 8 will enter defensive by giving you at least 10 brace plus Gear Up. Not to mention the second shuffle. Whenever you've already entered defensive mode once with 20 brace, you need 30 brace the next time, and you don't have Gear Up, but you will have maybe some HP loss. Maybe you'll have some extra brace from the leftover brace numbers. Let's say you have a Priming Shot, Roll Attack, and Curl Up. You enter defensive mode with these 2. That's 20. You play these on your first shuffle for another 12. And then you reshuffle, you get another 12 plus 10. That's 12, 12, and 10 is 34. So yeah, just having these 2 cards gives you a chance to enter defensive before drawing Curl Up, and it gives you the opportunity to enter defensive mode on your second shuffle for the second time. So it makes a big splash, especially on that second shuffle. It makes your defensive mode a little bit more consistent on your first shuffle, and empowers the second shuffle whenever the fights go on that long. So yeah, that brace 8 is really important. As for the actual card effects, Priming Shot is good damage. I think this even got buffed by 1, and the upgrade is now 10, and brace is 6. 6 brace is actually pretty significant for a card, and it also has a socket, so you can throw Sapphire into it and make it a 10 brace card by itself. I'll get to that a bit more in a minute. Piercing Hide is kind of a weird jack-of-all-trades, as I've mentioned a few times in episodes. It gains 7 block and 2 temporary thorns, and braces as well. So it gets you closer to defensive mode, and it also blocks and gives a buff that's only relevant if the enemy is attacking, as well as only being relevant if the enemy is multi-attacking, or you're getting attacked by multiple enemies. 2 temporary thorns is not a lot. And honestly, 7 block is not that much either, and 3 brace is not that much either. It's a lot of small effects that kind of hope to add up to something, but often doesn't feel good enough to me, at least. I know some people like this card. You can throw an Onyx in it, and you get a Permanent Thorns, as well as it just being a good combo card with other things. You know, jack of all trades, lean into it, right? It also works with decks, I guess. You can also throw the Sapphire in this. Again, I'll talk to about that a bit later once I get to here. But overall, I think that Brace 3 and not upgrading to Brace 4 may end up hurting. It depends on how the brace numbers add up. Let's see. You need at least 10 to enter defensive mode before this, but you also need at least 10 to enter defensive mode the second shuffle. I guess it doesn't matter that much, so long as you get to 10. That being said, 3 is on the lower side. You want to average 3 and a third. So, like, if you take a 3, your next 2 brace cards have to be at least 7. So you would need a 3 and a 4. And if you end up taking 3 brace cards, then you're in a pickle, right? So even Recover has something on that. You can upgrade it. It gives more block and more brace. And honestly, a more powerful effect. This card is just better than Piercing Hide. I guess except for the socket. But anyway, aside from that... Wait, this doesn't give more block. This is 8 block when upgraded. This is 9. Okay. My bad. Priming Shot, did I mention... Yeah, this is okay damage. You can take this in the early game as a common block card, and it braces for a decent amount, too. Good mix of offense and defense, unlike Iron Wave. Recover, its main effect is really the stasis thing. The 3 brace is mostly just a bonus. It matches with the 8 brace from roll attack and the other 2, like I mentioned. But yeah, stasis is the main thing. If you manage to match it with a brace 8, then that's good. That's very good. But I think this card has a major downside in that it costs 1 energy for 5 block. I compare this card to a defend a lot. Its power doesn't really come online until you get a card into stasis that's worth putting into stasis. That being said, control over stasis by putting a bunch of by being able to choose from any card in your discard can end up being very powerful. Kind of similar to Hologram in that way. But it does feel like it takes time to really come online. And until it does, you're stuck with a defense worth of power. And the Brace 3 is really not that much. There is also something to be said about the consistency of your draw. If you have Roll Attack or Resilient Plate or Shield Spikes, the Brace 8 with the combo, you still have to draw both those cards before Curl Up in order for it to be relevant before the second shuffle. So that's like a 1 in 3 chance of happening. Yes, that's a 1 in 3 chance of happening. So, not negligible, but doesn't happen in a lot of fights. So what you'll then do is, either take another 3 and a 4, or you'll take another 8, and then that makes it a lot more likely because if you have 2 8s and a 3, any combination of those 2 cards before Curl Up will make you enter defensive earlier. So yeah, so even if you have enough for defensive mode on your first and second shuffles, to enter it twice, you still want to take more brace cards in order to enter it faster. At least most of the time, I think. So it is important to keep going, even if what you have seems like enough. Maybe if you get advanced enough, you can keep track of exact brace numbers and how that affects with your deck. I don't even go that far. Most of the time. Sometimes I can do it if I feel like I can handle it, or if I really need to try and do it, but usually I don't. It's a lot of effort for something that is not an exact science to me. Anyways, moving on to Roll Attack. Kind of a weird one. It has this condition: if you're in defensive mode, it attacks all enemies, otherwise it braces for 8. This looks really good. If you're in defensive mode, it affects all enemies. Because like I said, 2 energy for 16 damage is not very good by itself, but if you're in defensive mode, and if it's attacking all enemies, then that's suddenly a lot more worth it. The problem here is that effect is really hard to get, because you need a lot of brace to enter defensive. And if you need a lot of brace to enter defensive, this is the card you want to use to enter defensive. You want to use this card to brace 8. Especially because if you're keeping up your brace in the late game, you don't want this effect, because then you don't brace for 8. This brace 8 is the more important thing, because it's more consistent. It provides you defensive value, even though this is good. I will say that when you can proc this, if you can proc it, it's good. The problem is being able to do it. I feel like most of the time you need either a ton of defensive mode, or you need to have just lost a ton of HP the turn before so that you enter defensive when you draw this. But anyway, I kind of mentioned this before. 16 damage for 2 energy is not very much usually, but Guardian is a stalling character. Defensive mode usually buys them at least 1 turn per fight, per entry. So 1 defensive mode entry gains you another turn in the fight, 2 gains you another 2 turns in the fight, and so on. So 16 damage, while a bit low, doesn't really care about the low numbers because with enough turns you'll win. And you can have those enough turns because you're entering defensive enough. The other part of why this is good is because it braces 8. And brace 8 is huge. I already mentioned about the combo with low brace cards, but it can also combo with high brace cards. And a number like this means that you can keep up your defensive mode very easily in the late game, so long as you have enough of them. I have made 2 episodes now about something completely unprecedented in my runs, which became roll attack decks, where the main gimmick of my deck was that I just had a lot of roll attacks, and it provided a solid damage and good defense because of defensive mode. Those were really funny, and I had no idea that they would even be possible. Like, when I first started playing Guardian, this card didn't seem very good to me, and I know it doesn't seem good to others either because I've discussed it with them back when I was starting too. But I went from it being a card that I didn't want to being a card that I think is actually really good, A-tier card, to being a card that can straight up be its own deck in a meme kind of way, and that blew my mind. I don't think it's as good as a solo carry card, but it happened because of the circumstances, and that was incredible to me. So yeah, do not underestimate this card. Take it in Act 1, sometimes even take it later in the game if you need brace, and have energy to play the brace. Okay, up next, Sapphire. A new addition to the common pool, as well as a buff to its brace number. Went from 3 to 4. Doesn't seem like a big change, but it is a gem, which means that it can be combined with any other socketed card, and if you do it with a lot of them, then you suddenly have a lot of brace on the table. This can become especially possible if you have a gem finder. I have not yet tried this strategy by putting a bunch of sapphires into things, but I think it's a cool idea. One thing I do want to mention now is to reiterate the idea that brace doesn't do anything until you enter defensive with it. It's an investment. So low brace numbers like these have to be a very small investment. But being a gem, you also have to combo this with putting it into cards. So what kind of card would you want to put a small investment in? And I think the answer, unless you're putting this into every card to enter defensive mode consistently, I think the answer is to just put it into other cards that have brace attached to them, such as these. Actually, those are the only ones in this, aren't they? Yeah, these are the only brace socket cards, and they're all commons. So once you put this into these, it makes that card a lot more likely to enter defensive mode. Which is what you want to use brace for anyway. And that gives you a lot more control over your brace, as well as a lot more likelihood to use it for front load. The other option would be to put this into cards that don't brace. But let's work out this situation here. Let's say you have a roll attack and a sapphire. That adds up to more than 10. That'll give you the chance to play that with gear up, and then you can enter defensive mode. So if I socket this into roll attack, if I draw the roll attack before the curl up, I can play these both and then enter defensive. Now let's say I put this into a reroute, which is the card that makes the next card you play go into stasis, and has a socket. So now I have 2 cards with enough brace. Usually spreading out effects makes it more consistent, but this is the opposite. Well, no, it's actually more consistent, but in the wrong direction. Usually spreading out effects makes you more consistent in a good way. This makes you more consistent in a bad way, because you need to draw both cards with the brace in order to enter defensive, which means that you're guaranteed to enter defensive when you draw the last card, instead of it being a positive effect. It actually makes you wait to enter defensive more. Meanwhile, if you put this in roll attack, you only have a 50-50 of drawing it early or late, but that's still better than a 100% chance of drawing enough to enter defensive late. So this is why I socket cards like this into brace cards. And overall, I think it works out. Roll attack especially, since this adds up to more than 10, it means that spending 2 energy on a damaging card can still be safe, because I can enter defensive with the other brace 10. And as I mentioned before, you can upgrade priming shot to brace 6, and then that will also brace 10. Very strong combo. I've gotten to use that I think once. I think I've done it twice. I know I've done it at least once in the series. And it's felt very good. Felt very powerful. Haven't done it in Piercing Hide yet. I got to do it once with the uncommon version of this that braced 3, and it didn't feel very good. But I think this is slightly better because I only need a brace 3 to get that magic number of 10 now. So I'll have to try it if the time arises. I think especially because this is a common gem, and it has a higher chance of showing up, both because of its rarity and also because of Bronze Gear giving you a common gem at the start of the run. We'll be much more likely to see this, and I'm going to be socketing this in a lot of brace cards in the early game pretty frequently now. Alright, Shield Charger. This is a bit of a weird one to explain. It's very strong in my opinion. This used to be even stronger because it also used to give you 1 energy every turn. I should probably explain this. Tick is whenever it spends a turn in stasis, or whenever it's accelerated, it activates this effect. So you place it into stasis. If you have no accelerate, you wait a turn, but then it gives you 10 block and 4 brace. Basically, it's like a pseudo defensive mode. You're gaining 10 block every turn with it in play, which is the same as defensive mode. It just doesn't give you the blur, and it doesn't give you the immediate benefit the turn you play it. It costs 2, which is kind of a hefty cost. If you have some other way to put it in stasis, that's good. But overall, having block over several turns, 3 turns, even if it's not immediate, is still worth a lot. It does, unfortunately, Guardian has a lot of things that like setup, and not as much front load, which means that this can be kind of hard to play in certain situations, which means it's situational. It's good because it's not an insta pick. Insta picks are kind of boring sometimes. But if you can afford to grab this and put it into play, it will give you a lot of block and a lot of consistency, and it gives you a bonus 4 brace every turn it's in stasis, up to a total of 12. And if you upgrade it, it's actually 18. This is actually a huge. This 4 to 6 is actually huge from my own experience, because it can actually hit that magic number of 10 a lot easier. It only takes 2 turns, as well as giving you an extra 8 on top of that. Yeah, it's overall just very good. 12 block, not so much. This is more of a late game upgrade, or mid to late game upgrade, I guess. Late Act 2, I think I would start considering this. But overall, this has felt very powerful. It just needs the conditions to be met to play it. You need to know that you're not going to take a lot of damage the turn that you draw this most of the time. There's also a couple of things, like Snecko Eye makes this a little bit worse because when the cost goes down, it goes into stasis for less. I think it's still good at 1 cost. 0 cost, not so much. But 1 cost, pretty good. Overall, I think the brace is kind of a small bonus when unupgraded, but when upgraded, becomes a very powerful bracing tool for keeping up your defensive mode later. And I don't think this messes with your control too often. I've had a couple times where it enters defensive mode before I want it to, but that's usually my own fault. It's another thing to keep track of course. But you know, practice makes perfect, and that doesn't just go for this card, that goes for the whole game. Learning to keep track of all the different things going on over time is just a skill you have to learn. I guess a couple more things to note is that this is a card that exhausts whenever it leaves stasis. It's volatile, which is what that means. Whenever it's done being in stasis, it exhausts, and that means that it runs out. You can't use it anymore for the rest of the fight. And that is also another thing to consider about the card. It is very powerful, kind of front load. As long as you can block the turn you play it, then it gets you some short term block. It's a lot of block at that. But after that, if you're like relying on shield chargers for block, you're gonna eventually run out, and then in the late game you're gonna get punished for it. So don't rely on these too much. Enjoy when you can use it, because this is a lot of block. I keep saying that, but it's really important. But late game you do need to consider how you're scaling up the rest of your block in your deck. And that kind of goes hand in hand with the brace thing anyway, because brace runs out too. Eventually, it gets harder to enter defensive every time. Okay. Now we have the protocols. We used to have one more armored protocol that I'm kind of sad has left, but oh well. We have evasive protocol, spiker protocol, and revenge protocol. The wording between these is inconsistent. Weird. Anyways, while in defensive mode, evasive protocol is while in defensive mode, raise your dexterity by 3. Spiker protocol gives you 4 thorns when you're in defensive mode, and revenge protocol gives you 2 strength when you're in defensive mode. So dex, thorns, strength. But whenever you leave defensive mode, they're gone. They don't stack every time you enter defensive. So these are temporary things. And they all have, at the start of your turn, brace for a bit. These 2 brace for 3. This one was recently nerfed to brace for 4. Don't really understand why. Anyways, these all have their own niche uses. I don't think bracing for 3 every turn is very much, in my experience. Maybe I should think about that a little bit more. That is another setup card, and it's set up on top of setup because it doesn't give you anything the turn you play it, and it gives you very small brace numbers, which means it may not give you benefit for several turns. I think that's why it feels so weak. But while I was making the notes for this video, I realized that if I'm low on brace, taking some of these could actually save me, because it could put me into defensive mode when I need it, by giving me the brace over time, and could even stay somewhat relevant through longer fights by allowing me maybe 1 or 2 more turns of defensive, depending on 1 or 2 extra turns of defensive on top of that first turn, depending on how much other brace I have. And I've had 1 or 2 runs where I've actually had that aforementioned defensive mode run where I stack a bunch of brace cards. That gets harder now that Armored Protocol is gone, which used to give you 5 block at the end of your turn when you're in defensive. But anyway, brace, yeah, these numbers are not very big. Brace 4, I think, is the minimum passable number to make it usable in general without it being that really niche situation where you don't have much brace. Also, this upgrades to 5 brace. The other 2 don't even upgrade to give you more brace. They give you more of their defensive mode benefit. But anyway, aside from the brace numbers, like 5 is good. 4 is like minimal, 5 is good. 6 would be pretty dang good. 6 is probably not necessary. I would like to see these all raised by 1. I'd like these to brace for 4 and this one to brace for 5 and maybe give a stronger effect since it's a rare. I don't know. This needs a buff. Regardless, I was about to talk about their things. While in defensive mode, give you a buff. There are times when those are useful, but it has a major problem. The major problem is that you're getting these buffs when you enter defensive mode, which you can usually control, but also at the same time, not really. There are 2 ways to use defensive mode. Like I said, you either use it to get you block on the turn you're being attacked, or the turn before, so that the blur will carry the block over. The problem is that all 3 of these cards only work on one of those situations. Thorns only works on that first turn you're getting attacked. Revenge Protocol... Actually, Thorns only works on that turn you're getting attacked. I guess Evasive works on either one. No, let me start over here. Thorns only works if you're in defensive mode on the turn you're being attacked. So you can't use the blur effect if you want the Thorns. Evasive Protocol, 3 dexterity does a lot. If you upgrade, it's 5. I think that's pretty good for the Watcher buff on Niao in the downfall mode. I've used that a few times in order to gain enough block to block the Divinity turn. It's pretty effective against that. But otherwise, usually you're going to be gaining way too much block to actually effectively use the dexterity. In fact, it may not even be necessary at all. Usually you overblock by a lot, so the best time to use it is when you're getting attacked for a lot on the turn you enter defensive and the turn after, so that you make the most of your current turn and your blur. Otherwise, you're just wasting a lot, and the card already has consistency issues and a lot of conditions to make it work. Even more conditions to make their secondary effect useful. Revenge Protocol, 2 strength is not very much. That's my complaint. 3 strength is a little bit better, but still not very much. It also suffers from consistency issues because you also need attacks on that turn. And I guess for this one, you can maybe make the argument that Stasis is your friend, but that's, again, more conditions to make something work. I really do think that these have way too many conditions for them to be useful. Like, when they're useful, I'm not going to complain. When they work, they work. They feel okay. But most of the time, when I see them in my card reward, I feel sad that I did not get a better card. I am like, oh, well, looks like I only have 2 cards in this card reward. You know. Alright, after tackling 3 and 1 there, let's move on. Resilient Plate. Reduces each of your debuffs by 2, brace 8. And it upgrades to not exhaust. Pretty niche upgrade, but still useful sometimes. The combination of the debuff reduction and the 8 brace is very strange, but it works. I think kind of similar to Roll Attack, the main effect is actually the brace 8. Unlike Roll Attack and Shield Spikes, this also only costs 1. And I guess an upgrade, if you want to use this for consistent brace. And what you do sometimes. I think if you make good use of brace in your deck, you can take this without any debuffs. Because, you know, as some enemies will debuff you, but mainly the brace 8 to enter defensive mode consistently is really, really good. And this is super efficient, being 1 energy for 8 brace. And 1 draw, of course. The debuff reduction on top of that, I think 8 brace is good. I don't think it's necessarily good enough to be an insta-pick with the whole effect, honestly. But reducing each of your debuffs by 2 is conditionally very good as well. Being able to scale 2 strength at a time or 2 dex at a time, sometimes even 2 thorns at a time, can be really strong. A very, very quick way to scale up and during a fight. So not only are you getting good defensive mode value from it, you're also getting good scaling value from it, so long as you have the pieces. I think that this is... I know we were just talking about conditions, but these have so many conditions. This does not need very many. It's good with the brace 8 and an upgrade by itself. This works with... And it doesn't take very much for this to find temporary buffs in your deck to do it, but there's also even enemy debuffs. Whenever an enemy debuffs you, you reduce those debuffs by 2. It's not very often that an enemy debuffs you for a lot of stacks of something. So reducing it by 2 is actually extremely powerful. It handles Well, I guess some of the most powerful effects only have one stack, like Hexed or Sneko's Confusion, which you only need one stack for. But stuff like Vulnerable, Frail, and Weak, reducing 2 stacks is huge. So overall, I think, like, when I first saw this card, I wasn't a big fan of it either, but I've very slowly been realizing just how strong this is as a card. 1 energy Brace 8 is so efficient. This is so useful a lot of the time. The upgrade makes it more consistent in the late game. Overall, I just like the card. I think its main weakness is that it doesn't provide any kind of front load. Unless you have enough brace to enter defensive with it. So you can't, like, most of the time in the early game you can't just take this as like a floor 1 through 3 pick. You need to wait until you've fought maybe 1 or 2 elites in Act 1. Which makes it kind of sad to skip. I like the card. I know a certain someone who also likes the card because of the debuff reduction. I think it's balanced pretty well, though, all things considered. I'm going to skip over to Shield Spikes real quick. We'll come back to Sentry Wave in a second. Shield Spikes on their 2 energy Brace 8 card. It's also got that condition, same as Roll Attack, where if you're in defensive mode, you gain a different effect instead of the Brace. This used to be temporary Thorns, which absolutely sucked. Now that it's permanent, and I've gotten to try it a couple times, it actually feels pretty good. The upgrade upgrades to 4 permanent Thorns. Especially in the Heart fight, this is really important, but it can be pretty good against long fights, like Act 3 bosses, even just Act 3 elites, Act 2 boss maybe sometimes. Nah, you don't usually enter defensive mode enough by Act 2 boss. Yeah, so usually Act 3 and beyond, the Thorns will give you good value even outside of something like the Heart, which attacks for so much. So I think that is a bit better than Roll Attack's condition. That being said, I still think you want the Brace 8 most of the time. I do think this is a bit of a weaker card recently. I used to think it was really, really good. But 2 energy for 12 block is actually not that great. Contrary to Roll Attack, where the damage number being low is fine, the block number being low is actually worse. Because in order to supplement a stalling playstyle like Guardian has, you need to have a higher amount of defense than normal, rather than being okay with a lower amount. And yes, we have defensive mode to give us some bonus block, but still, 2 energy for 12 block is not usually very good. This is the same numbers as Ironclad's Flame Barrier, but I think that Ironclad makes better use of the 12 block than Guardian does. Guardian has Dexterity, but they want to spend it on 1 and 0 cost cards more than a 2 cost card. Also, this being 2 cost just by principle makes it harder to use in a deck most of the time. Gives you a lot less value from your other cards. The Brace 8 is probably the strongest part of the card, but which made me feel like it was a good card for a while, although I have been feeling a little bit less confident in this card recently. Has felt like it's been holding me back a bit. Looking at my win rates, this card has apparently been less than my average. So maybe just keep an eye out for this. If you need some front-loaded block, this will probably have your back. If you need some reliable block in longer fights, this is probably not going to do it for you. It's probably just better for the Thorns every once in a while. Maybe just once a fight. That's kind of how I'm feeling about this. Maybe that'll collapse into something more coherent later. Alright, Sentry Wave Plus, a bit of a weird one, because Sentry Blast is actually the normal card, and it has to be upgraded. If you don't have an upgrade, which I can't show, it does not brace 2. So a couple things about this. Sentry Blast, Sentry Wave is pretty good, just by itself. It deals damage every other turn, and it applies 1 weak every other turn to an enemy of your choice. And a weaken every other turn is really, really strong. Which makes me question why Brace is a part of this anyway. Like, I get that you kind of want to bring Guardian closer to defensive mode, but Weaken is already a very strong defensive tool that this is the only card that Guardian has for. this is the only weaken Guardian has in its kit. So, if you've already got something this powerful with the amount of block that Guardian gives, why are you also stacking the ability to enter defensive mode on top of it? Also, it's not even very much. Brace 2 seems like okay until you realize that this is only every other turn. So, this is only one brace per turn on average, which is a third of a protocol. Not great. Also, this takes up a stasis slot. Like Sentry Blast, Sentry Wave, like it does consistent damage, does very consistent weaken defense, but the upgrade, I don't know, this doesn't feel very worth it. This feels like the kind of upgrade between the damage, like this gives you 2 damage, so it's also 1 damage per turn on average. This feels like the kind of upgrade whenever you're just short on damage against something in Act 1, rather than actually needing the brace for something, or needing the damage for late game. It just doesn't feel like it's worth the upgrade most of the time. You know what, maybe I should consider not upgrading this, even in the scenario I just said, because I could maybe upgrade some other card for future value. Who knows? But yeah, I don't think this is even good for a magic number, the magic number 10, either. Maybe I could be wrong about that, though. Brace 2 matches with the Brace 8 cards to make 10. I think it would be a little bit hard to say that you could get 4 Brace, because that costs 4 turns, if you count the first turn as turn 1. Which I do because you want to have value on the turn you play it. I think, and because it's 2 cards, that plus a Brace 8 card, it's still just a 1 in 3 chance that you get them before Curl Up. And this comes out on the second turn anyway, so it's even less odds. So yeah, I don't think this upgrade is amazing. It probably has a use somewhere, you gotta look for it if you want to find it. I don't think it's worth it, though, most of the time. Alright, our final card anyway. Spheric Shield. Gain 20 block, enter defensive mode. With the recent changes, Spheric Shield no longer gives you a ton of brace, and I really like that because entering defensive mode directly means that you don't have to tick up the brace counter requirements from entering defensive, you just get it for free. But they also changed the wording so that when you enter defensive mode directly, you don't get 10 block. I think that was to make this less confusing, so it didn't say gain 15 block, then you gain another 10 block from entering defensive. I don't agree with that choice, but I can see why it was made. But anyways, it does exactly what it says. You gain 20 block and enter defensive mode. You don't gain any bonus block because you entered it directly. It's basically Guardian's Impervious. Impervious being the 2 energy 330 block card on Ironclad that exhausts. Except this is attached to defensive mode. Very, very good front load. Also, it gives you front load. It's also an emergency blur option in case you need a lot of block for the next turn. And you can use this pretty freely because you don't have to worry about the brace counter. It's just free block whenever you draw it. It's good at every point in the game. Very strong. I like that it was changed away from brace to enter it directly. Makes it feel less janky and less... yeah, mainly less janky. Makes it feel more like the front load block with defensive mode attached that it's supposed to be. So yeah, not much to consider about this card anymore. I think it's better than most of Guardian's rares, to be honest. Even though it's just a stall tool, Guardian makes use of stalling very well, so I don't think that you need to consider offensive options too much against this. Obviously there will be situations pretty frequently, but this is just so powerful and works so well with what Guardian already wants to do that it's probably strong most of the time. If you were to consider this against other stalling tools like Vault, Vault is kind of like the card you take whenever you the other rares are not good. But this, like I said, Guardian already likes stalling and can make use of it by dealing damage during the stall. That's something that Vault can't do. So I think that this works very well in most situations. Alright, our final things. I already talked about Bronze Gear. Let's talk about Baylor's Lordly Plate. Whenever you brace one more. Something that I didn't know about this for a bit until I clarified it is that this does not count HP loss. So if you lose 5 HP, you're going to brace for 5 HP. This does not affect that. This is only whenever you play cards or have powers that give you brace. This feels extremely effective. One of the biggest ways that I notice this is when I have Gear Up Roll Attack. This adds up to 18. With Baylor's Lordly Plate, they both get one more. 11 and 9 is 20. You no longer need Curl Up or another card or a Sapphire in order to enter defensive. You can just do it with this. It also makes the protocols brace for one more every turn, although the powers stack on top of each other, so if I have one evasive protocol, that'll brace for 4 every turn, but if I have evasive and spiker or 2 evasives, it'll brace for 6 plus 1, or 7 instead of 8, 1 for each. So, gets less effective the more of these you have, but if you have one, pretty darn good. This on a Revenge protocol would be pretty sick. 6 brace per turn. Also works with Shield Charger. It works with every single instance of Brace. These all count as just one instance, unfortunately. But if you have an Evasive Protocol and a Shield Charger, those will be one instance each. So you get 2 extra. So you get 2 Brace per turn, as long as this is here. And this feels really, really strong because I mentioned these two, but also Shield Charger bracing for 5 on multiple turns is good. Bracing for 7 on 3 turns is 21, which crosses over another 10 brace threshold, which is good for entering defensive on additional times. Also makes Sapphires brace for 5, makes all the small brace cards brace for extra, so if you've garnered a good number of these plus Sapphires, you'll be bracing for a ton really, really fast, especially if you put a Sapphire in these, because those will also be separate instances. It will say brace 3, brace 4. The Baylor's Lordly Plate will turn that into brace 4, brace 5. Yeah, this is... overall, we have relic stats attached, so it will actually show you additional brace gain per turn per combat. It may not seem like very much, but it will get you into defensive mode a lot more easily when you need it. And again, brace really only matters when you get into defensive mode. Any other time it's just an investment. So, yeah, the fact that this gets you into defensive more frequently and with more control is the most important part of this, and makes it very strong. May even make Sentry Wave worth it, because it'll brace 3 instead. A little bit of a buff there. Alright, final thing to talk about, I think. Guardian Gear. This is the starter relic upgrade. You no longer get Gear Up, the 10 brace card, but you start each combat in defensive mode, which lasts for 3 turns. This is insanely strong. It's basically all 3 boat relics stapled together, kinda. You get your anchor, you get your turn 1 block for 10. You get Horde Cleat, instead of it blocking for 14, you get 10 again, but you also have the Blur from turn 1. And then you got your Captain's Wheel for turn 3, and plus all the block from the first 2 turns that you didn't use. Also, because of the way defensive mode works, you also get 10 block for exiting defensive, plus the block remaining from last turn. So really, this gives you block for 4 turns. And that's so much defense. You're gaining 10 block every turn for 4 turns. Against every fight, you are extremely safe. You only need a couple block cards in order to really... You only need a few block cards in order to stay safe for the rest of the fight. It doesn't mess with your brace counter at all. It enters defensive mode directly, just like the potion and the card. It also means that the protocols give you benefits consistently and over multiple turns, which is insane. Turns those cards into something actually very strong. You'll have Thorns every turn for 3 turns. You'll have Dexterity for all 3 turns, which I guess depends on what you're facing. You'll have Strength for every turn. And since you're in defensive mode all those times, you're going to be gaining Brace for every turn that you wait, and then you can enter defensive mode again while you're in defensive mode for those 3 turns and stack another 10 block plus 10 block later. So yeah, this is extremely strong. Before the last patch, which changed Bronze Gear, I would boss swap pretty much all the time. There would be some minor exceptions, mostly based on downfall mode, facing Ironclad in Act 1. So I would rarely ever get to see this. But now I get a much higher chance to see this now that this is something that I actually like to take. Yeah, not much else to say about this. This thing is insane. You may even be able to forego an extra energy even if you would normally need it. In fact, I did that recently in a recent episode. I forgot to mention about boss swapping in general. This is everything I talk about gear up is the reason that I don't boss swap anymore. At least not unless I get a really bad Act 1 and I need to get some extra power. Like if there's only a 1 elite path with 2 campfires or something really lame. Then I'll trade the starter relic for something that I can trade in for more power later, since I'm not getting power in the early game. Alright. I thought this was going to be the last thing, but this is the last thing. Polishing oil. I guess all I have to say about this is that it's strong. Probably one of the strongest potions. Not quite as strong as a Ghost in a Jar, I don't think, but still very solid. You get defensive mode for free during a fight. You gain 10 block, you get Blur, you get 10 block next turn. So I usually block it to block 2 turns worth of stuff, since I don't have to worry about brace counters. You can use it exactly when you need it, rather than having to wait for cards. And you get a ton of block for using it too. Way better than a block potion. So yeah, I'm always happy to see this one. Alright, I think that's about everything I have to say about defensive mode. I think, like, a lot of the stuff I talked about is stuff that I had to learn over time from playing the character. The brace numbers and how those add up exactly, and how they interact with defensive mode, along with its role in the game, the role of brace cards in general. It's not very intuitive. It's definitely something that you have to learn from playing the character, or from hearing it from someone else. Which is why I don't think the character is very popular in general. I mentioned at the beginning of this episode that defensive mode, that Guardian suffers from a lot of not being very clear on how to play or understanding it in the first place. Its major mechanics all being either difficult to use or understand, or both. But overall, as long as I think I've covered everything that you need in order to start to really use defensive mode to its full potential. And hopefully it makes it a lot more clear to you in your own runs about how to use it, and isn't so confusing. Alright, that's going to be it for this. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you stick around for my future videos. I will be making a part 3 on this, about stasis, and about how to use that effectively, as well as what it is, and how to understand it, and its place in Guardian. So that'll be coming out in probably about a month, because I do these every 10 episodes. Alright, if you stick around by then, I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.